Good morning and thank you for joining us on Your World this Tuesday morning. We are still within the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence. Excuse me. That starts on the 25th of November all through to the 10th of December. Now, the 25th actually marks the International Day of the Elimination of Violence Against Women, and the 10th of December, the Human Rights Day. Now, the objective of this day is to actually call for the prevention and elimination of violence against women and girls. So, on that note, the upward trajectory of cases and victims of gender-based violence is of great concern, with the pandemic exacerbating the situation. This begs the questions: despite all the efforts put in place to thwart gender-based violence, why do we still have such high occurrences today? What are we missing? Well, we answer these and other questions in a moment. My name is Gladys Gashanja, and this is What Else You Can Expect.
Of informing the world, the entire world.
South Africa president slams rich countries, and Senegalese president also criticizes rich countries over discovery of the Omicron coronavirus variant. Mwingi survivors account what they went through as a level 4 hospital doctors start giving physical and psychosocial care. Well, Baringo Civil Society raises concerns over the increase of gender-based violence against persons living with disability. And Boda operators representatives from all counties sign a peace charter pledging to embrace peace and ahead of next year's elections. Thank you for joining us on this broadcast. As I mentioned this morning, we are focusing, or at least lending our contribution to the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence and really addressing the gaps therein. And speaking of which, our question of the day to you is: what more needs to be done to tackle the rising cases of gender-based violence in the country? What more needs to be done to tackle the rising cases of gender-based violence in the country? Talk to us. That hashtag is new normal, and as always, you can call us on those numbers that you will see at the bottom of your screen for any of your questions or contributions. But before we get to it, let's take a look at the impact of COVID-19 around the world. This morning, the numbers stand at 266,692,824 confirmed cases. Out of that number, 240,234,180 have recovered, and unfortunately, 5,277,598 have lost their battle to COVID-19. In the country, according to the Ministry of Health, 255,479 is the number of those confirmed to have contracted COVID-19 within the country. 248,444 are reported to have totally recovered, and unfortunately, we have lost 5,335 people to COVID-19 within the confines of Kenya. So now let's take a look at some of the stories making headlines this morning. And during the opening of the 7th edition of the Dakar International Forum on Peace and Security in Africa, South African President Cyril Ramaphosa and Senegalese President Macky Sall criticized rich countries over their treatment of South Africa after it announced the discovery of the Omicron coronavirus variant.
Is that when South African scientists discovered, as President Macky Sall was saying, Omicron, the new variant, they immediately took on the responsibility of informing the world, the entire world, that a new variant has come through. And what is the result? The northern countries impose a ban to punish the excellence that comes from Africa. They basically say, we will not allow you to travel around. But lo and behold, Omicron is spreading all over the world.
Meanwhile, while speaking at the Pasteur Institute in Dakar, ahead of that peace forum uniting European and African leaders, the French Minister of Foreign Affairs, Jean-Yves Le Drian, urged synergies for better COVID-19 vaccine coverage in Africa. The Foreign Minister also added the idea of this forum, which has started 7 years ago as a defense minister, is to ensure that a culture of shared security develops in Africa and that in the future, the security of African countries belongs to Africa. And so we must create this movement, this dynamic, through exchanges, through synergies between the various actors.
The idea of this forum, which I started 7 years ago as a defense minister, is to ensure that a culture of shared security develops in Africa and that in the future, the security of African countries belongs to Africans. And so we must create this movement, this dynamic, through exchanges, through synergies between various actors.
Des synergies qu'il nous faut développer entre les différents acteurs.
Back home, and doctors at the Mwingi Level 4 Hospital have started giving physical and psychosocial care to 7 people who survived the tragic accident. Now, we sat down with some of them earlier today or yesterday evening, and they relayed their moments of horror underwater, which to some felt like an eternity.
Was after a 44-seater bus belonging to the St. Joseph Seminary in Mwingi was removed from the river Nziu. The scene of the accident was quiet, the raging waters having died down, leaving only a small, slow stream. The bus in which some of the deceased were recovered from, a shell on the banks of the river a few yards away. As the river Nziu slowly thins out, leaving just the bare sand, on the banks of this river here, many are collecting their pieces while they hope that the infrastructure here will be heavily improved, not to take away lives and property in the future. More than 30 kilometers away in Mwingi town, survivors grappling to come to terms with events of the last 48 hours, the few seconds they were underwater still playing back in many of their minds.
Najaribu kuavoid. Nalala mara nyingine nashindwa kulala. Kama usiku ule wa kwanza juzi nilishindwa kulala. Shindwa kulala kabisa usiku mzima sikulala. Kwa sababu unajaribu kuona vile watoto wadogo. Rika la miaka 6, katoto kanatolewa, ukikaangalia utafikiria kako hai, kamekufa, kanatolewa, watoto wenye walikuwa ndani wanalia. Ni watu wenye tunajuana, wenye wengi wenye tulikuwa kwa hiyo gari. Na fulana amekufa, fulana amekufa, fulana amekufa. Sasa hiyo picha ikinaponigia inanifanya kichwa kinauma.
Na kwa mawazo mimi sijui kama nitasahau yale nilipitia. Kwanza wenzangu nilikuwa naimba nao pale tu kando ya mito, alafu kigafla tena hakuna, hawako. Inakuwa ni vigumu sana kusahau.
Collins is a bitter man. Even as he counts his blessings that he is alive, he says that while police officers from the nearby Nguni police station were on the scene 10 minutes later, they could do nothing much as many died in the river.
Polisi wamesema tu kuna bunduki. Wapewe training ya first aid. Every region. Wapewe training ya hata kama ni poison, hata kama ni wajue namna wanaokoa wananchi wanapokuwa kwa shida. Kwa maana wao ndio wanakuwa watu wa kwanza kufika kwenye mikasa. Unangoja daktari wa ambulance, labda ambulance iko mwingi, inachukua masaa mawili. Watu wamekufa. Tunaangamia kwa sababu ya improper planning.
Collins says that once he was pulled out of the water, it was another battle getting across the river back into waiting ambulances.
Sasa huyo aliponipatia hiyo 100, nikafikiria sasa hapa ni njia ni kuvukisha upande ule, na wanaovukisha na wale wanaobeba watu ama wakushike mkono uvuke. Mimi nikawaambia jamaa, si mnibebe mnivukishe upande ule. Jamaa mwingine akaniambia kama unataka kuvukisha upande ule ulete 100. Na mimi nimepewa 100. Nikamwambia bwana mimi ni wale manusura. Akaniambia bwana hakuna cha manusura. Wewe ulete 100.
A driver who knew him from Nguni gave him 150 shillings, 100 of which he paid 2 men to carry him across the river. Once he got to the other side, he thought he would get help from an ambulance standing by with another patient. But after waiting for almost an hour and shifting vehicles, the Nguni police boss finally came to their rescue. The men say the events of Saturday will remain in their minds for a long time.
Ilipotaka kuondoka kwa nguvu inaenda, niligutukia tayari gari pale imeanza kurudi upande mmoja. Nikafikiria ni kama si kweli, manake tu ni kama tunakaribia kuvuka. Lakini mara nikasikia gari kuna mlio unalia. Kaka gari ndio hiyo.
Athini hivi. Maji ilikuwa imeshajaa ndani yao basi. Kukawa giza. Hauoni kitu. Ni sauti tu ndogo ndogo unasikia watu wakisema Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. Alafu kidogo hivi tunaanza kusikia hii bubble ya maji tu ikitoka. Hakuna kitu kingine.
Leila Mohamed, NTV, Mwingi in Kitui County.
A very sad occurrence there, and it's a story that we shall continue to follow up on even as the survivors recuperate in hospital and the loved ones of those that actually lost their lives put them or lay them to rest. Now, let's switch gears to something that is also equally concerning, and we're talking about gender-based violence. This conversation we're having within the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence. Now, today, would like to address what the gaps are in ensuring that we eliminate GBV. What is this that keeps feeding the numbers that we are seeing today, and especially now that we've seen these numbers exacerbated within the pandemic? And to help me along with this conversation, I have with me in studio Faith Nashipai, who is the founder and executive director of Thriving Families Kenya. We are also joined by Dr. Griffins Manguro, who is the country director and CEO at the International Center for Reproductive Health Kenya, and of course Lena Kanyangi, who is a project manager at Amref Health Africa. Thank you all for being part of this conversation. And even as we talk about the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence, the first instinct is that we're only talking about women, but we cannot forget the boy child in this conversation, right, Faith?
So true, so true.
And why?
We can't leave out the man. First, because he's part of gender. When we talk about gender equality, we have to talk about the two genders. Mainly, that is the man and the woman. And we also cannot leave the man behind, because looking at statistics, the National Crime Data Center did a research last year on a little bit of gender-based violence and the status of the girl. And the question was, is is the girl being disempowered. So that report brought out a very disturbing statistic that in 6 months within COVID, we had 92.2% increase of GBV in the country. Now, looking at that, you realize that about 99% of that were men who were perpetrators. Then it goes further to again desegregate this age group and says 18 to about 35, 45 are the main perpetrators. Now, we cannot talk about gender-based violence without talking about the man and bringing him on this discourse and making him a preventer and not a perpetrator.
Okay, and as we talk about the gaps there, the nature of GBV at times varies across cultures, fed by different, beliefs and systems within the different countries and regions. Lena, you predominantly work with the Nyanza region of this country. What are the gaps you see there?
I think when the pandemic started, you realized that schools closed, and there was that charter that we need to open schools because girls are safe, not in the community. So one of the biggest gaps we have found is the lack of community involvement, especially providing information on gender-based violence for girls, where to access help. So if this happens in the community, then as a woman or a young girl, where do you get information? Where do you report to? And where do you access this help? So information basically on how to take care of yourself, or where to report, or which channels to follow if you are affected by this. Those are some of the gaps. But most importantly, just providing information to basic communities on basic gender-based violence. What is it? What are the factors that could predispose a young girl or you as a man? What makes you vulnerable? What are the vulnerabilities? Those are things that we really need to focus on, and we've been focusing on providing information and just looking at the main issues around the things that really perpetrate, like access to safe water, and for young girls who are very vulnerable, access to menstrual hygiene products. So these are things that really put women on the rather what I would say the downside for gender-based violence, that it makes them more vulnerable. Yeah.
Okay, now Griffins, you work closely and provide services to key populations, and this is one part of the population that most don't think about. We're talking about female sex workers, those in the LGBTQ community. What are the gaps there?
I think a lot of it is in terms of understanding the heightened vulnerability towards sexual violence. So most of the marginalized communities, so key populations and the LGBTQI communities have very high risks of sexual and gender-based violence. And that's something that is usually understated or underestimated. The second thing is access to health services. Again, most of these communities tend to be very stigmatized at the moment. So even when they experienced SGBV, or when they experience any form of violence for that matter, health-seeking behavior is not as high, because again, they fear going to a health facility and getting stigmatized, given that they're already part of a very stigmatized society. So it becomes very difficult, but it also becomes very important to provide services that are very tailored towards such communities, just so as to increase and to be able to have or to get them access to these services. Again, the third thing, which is also very related to the COVID-19 pandemic, was also the fact that for most of these communities, there was a loss in income, and this led to establishing very many domestic partnerships, which again led to an increase in sexual and gender-based violence. So again, all these factors come to play to, one, increase the predisposition towards sexual and gender-based violence, but at the same time also to reduce the access to services for SGBV, which now compounds the problem.
And perhaps with the populations that you deal with, therein you see now how both male and the females are actually vulnerable in this case.
Yeah, definitely. But I think even for the general population, males are still vulnerable. But what's interesting for males is that so speaking of the general population, most of the males who are vulnerable to SGBV are usually quite young, under the age of 15 years. So I think we did a study sometime in 2019 that showed about 80% of survivors who are male were less than 15 years of age. So again, that also brings that question of the age demographics of male survivors.
Now, Faith, you just came from Iten, and of course, we have been following on the story about the alleged murder of the late athlete Agnes Tirop, and in itself, it has brought to the fore many gaps in this community. Tell us what you found out.
Well, thank you so much, and let me appreciate the Fourth Estate and mainly Nation Media for covering the story. We had a whole week of working together with our partners UNFP and the county government of Elgeyo Marakwet to reach out to the athletic community. And in reaching out to the athletic community, one thing that I noticed is that about 80% of the people that we trained were men among the athletes. Then we also had quite a lot of issues that came from our discussions, and some of these issues were major violations of people, of life, of humans. A lot of abuse that is happening in the training camps, and with managers and the people that they are managing, the athletes that they are managing. You find a child who's going to run away from home to pursue their athletic career, and they land in a camp, and that is a minor. Number one, that child leaves school, so that is already something that exposes that child to the wrong kind of life. Because you find that our athletes, when they get their medals, they are not able to communicate. That is actually where the problem starts. Then the next thing that we realized is that we have coaches and managers who will take advantage of these girls. In the name of helping them and seeing them through, they sexually take advantage of them. So one of the things we got to hear is that we are having a lot of abortions among our athletic community. Now that again brings a lot of issues to their health, because someone is aborting at this level, and within maybe 2-3 weeks they're supposed to be running an international race and all that, and it becomes a problem to them. So health-wise, these are people who are having challenges. Then you find that they have to maintain their lives. They have to take care of their lives when they are at the camps. Some of these camps are paid up. Most of them are paid up. Maintaining their lives at the home of champions is also a challenge, because we realize that we don't just have athletes from Iten or Elgeyo Marakwet. They are coming from all over. I think I also interviewed an athlete from Meru. I talked to a few from Narok. When they had Nashipai, they were like, oh, you're from Narok. So they came looking for me. So you realize that there is a lot that is happening among the athletic community. But something about men. There's one athlete, there's one man who has a challenge, because he has worked with his wife, just a normal relationship, and the wife became a medalist at some point. But when she started winning, the coach took her off from him. So now the man is grappling with depression and loss, because his wife has been taken away from him. Well, we may say that people make decisions and people move on, but that is a violation on this man. He loved genuinely, he supported genuinely, he saw his wife blossom. Then someone just came and decided, I'm going to take this woman away from him and marry her. So that is a violation. But we don't interpret it as violation when it comes to our society. We don't look at the injustices that happen to men as an injustice. We only look at women, and we only look at how can she grow, how can she become. But we don't see the other side of things. Now, this is a man who is grappling with acute depression. He's suicidal, and I actually linked him up to support with some of our psychologists on ground. So at the end of the day, when we are talking about gender-based violence, let us not just say 16 days of activism against gender-based violence against women and girls. No, we are having men, like we had a man who was sodomized when we were there, somewhere in the villages. There's so many things that are happening to men, but people don't talk about them.
Very well said. And talking about violations, as the world continues to observe the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence, the Baringo Civil Society has raised concerns over the increase in cases of gender-based violence against persons living with disability. Now, speaking in Baringo County, the group indicates that the most prevalent type of gender-based violence is the sexual crimes. Now, this year alone, the county has recorded 152 cases of defilement with 14 cases of rape, but numbers are suspected to be higher. The civil society groups have called on the government to empower and educate people living with disabilities so that they can know their sexual and reproductive rights to avoid being exploited. Similarly, they are recommending for the need to strengthen the gender technical working groups in the counties, as well as develop gender-based violence recovery centers for victims to report cases and get help.
Kuna mahitaji ambapo bado hazijazingatiwa. Mahitaji ya dhulma za kijinsia, mahitaji ya msaada wa dharura wakati wa matukio kama majanga kama mafuriko, majanga kama ukame. Kutokuwa na nafasi ya kuzungumziana inaleta matukio ambayo yanaathiri binadamu.
One of the intervention that is on is the Gbv Bill that is at the County Assembly that was developed by the County Assembly. It is currently at the parliamentary printing stage where it just needs to be approved and printed for it to go to the public participation and adopted so that we will be able to address various issues.
Now, gender-based violence against people living with disabilities is not unique to Baringo County. Lena, in Nyanza region, how does that look like and what are the measures you're putting in place to protect these population?
Generally, people with disabilities are, I wouldn't want to say, but at a disadvantage because one, the information that is available on prevention and management of GBV is written in English. So if you have any other form of disability, either visual impairment or you cannot hear, then you have no access to that information. Even at community service level, reporting is a problem because you may not find someone who understands your language, or they are not, there is yet to develop a communication system, because unless you have learned the Braille or the sign language, then that's the most. But those in the community who have not had access to learn those languages, then for them to communicate that violation is very difficult for them. So again, then community members take advantage of this because they know, one, reporting for these people is quite a problem because they might have problems expressing themselves, and even at where they report, communication will be a problem. So, and two, they are also not well taken care of within communities, especially in rural areas. This is a population that is often neglected and as tied around, you know, disability in African culture is tied around with a lot of beliefs there could be something occurs within the community. So, and also coupled with poverty, then they are not well taken care of. So you'd find them, they are left by themselves, and people knowing that there is this disadvantage, then they take advantage of them. And like our friends in Baringo have said, sexual violence is highest for these especially young girls and even boys now that are being affected. And it's because they have no access to information. They are not well taken care of within the community. And even when they seek services, those at the very basic level, providing services to them like counseling is quite an issue because of that barrier in terms of communication, especially for those who are either visually or those who are deaf or those who have impairments in terms of their mental acuity has not developed as fast. So they remain a very vulnerable population within the community. And what is important is then to engage the community at the lowest level. One, to understand and also protect these people. As an organization, we've always talked about acknowledging and remunerating community health volunteers because those are the very basic structures in the community that can provide information in terms of to the community and also support the households to really take care of these vulnerable communities. And two, we also look at it from a perspective of the healthcare system, how it is well structured to provide services to GBV. And perhaps the referral system at the community level. So if someone like that is experiencing, what is their first point of entry? Do they go to the chief? Do they go to the health facility? And how do they manage that process? I think that is also one of the gaps, especially in terms of providing, do we have someone at the local level who can listen to, or who can at least interpret? Is there a counselor who can provide psychosocial support to these people who may not communicate like you and I are doing? And that's their fact. That is what makes them more vulnerable, and community members know, and they take advantage of that, unfortunately.
And speaking about the impact of culture and stigma, Griffins, this is a reality for the key populations you speak of. Talk about this experience.
No, so I think one of the things and if you note about GBV, it's about getting an enabling environment. And one of the things that culture does is that it promotes a culture of tolerance towards gender-based violence. And especially for LGBTQI and key population, this becomes a problem because people feel that these are members of communities that are marginalized. And so sometimes the level of tolerance for GBV in these communities is higher than the level of tolerance for GBV in the general community. So for example, we've had very many cases of persons who are, for example, transgender, who get sexually violated, and the community says, oh, but I mean, she is or he is transgender. And so, of course, with that kind of mindset and with a culture of tolerance towards violence for some of these communities, and because of the stigma and the fact that many people do not understand the communities, then it becomes very easy for people to say, okay, I mean, that is expected. That's the kind of thing that would happen. What did you expect, and so on. And so what happens when you get into such a mindset is that one, reporting for GBV for these communities might not be as high, to the level of seriousness, and the response towards GBV for these communities may not be as elaborate as what you'd expect, for example, if it's a child. The stigma surrounding the response or surrounding GBV in these communities might also, again, deter them from reporting when these cases happen. So I think what that does, and it promotes and it tolerates. And once you tolerate sexual and gender-based violence, you encourage the perpetrators. I think most studies have shown that many people who perpetrate GBV would do it again if it's not punished. And so when you have a situation where sexual violence towards a community goes unpunished, then what is expected is most people will feel that it's okay. And that promotes that culture of impunity.
And even as we continue to address the gaps when it comes to gender-based violence, remember our question of the day to you is, what more needs to be done to actually curtail the rising numbers of gender-based violence cases in this country? That hashtag is new normal, and you are talking to us. If you can have that feedback on the screen. We have a healer who says, the girls got more empowered and we forgot the boy child and were raised told to be men, never cry, concentrate on the boy child too. We hear you, healer. Abraham says people need to be enlightened by avoiding the much focus on one gender and also in form of regular education. Very true, Abraham. Thank you. Brenda says, this is so hard. My mind can't even comprehend what needs to be done, honestly. And I know it can feel overwhelming, especially when the numbers continue to rise and there's that feeling of nothing can be done, as we have actually stated. But the good news is, as we address the gaps, we are giving solutions of what needs to be done. Now, there's something else that perhaps we need to look into, and women's rights activists have identified Kalenjin traditions and customs that prevent married and single women from inheriting their father's land as actually one of the primary causes of gender-based violence against women in Kericho County. Now, speaking at Kabinga University, UOK, after leading students on a 15-kilometer walk from the university to Kericho town to mark the start of the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence, women's groups urge the community to abandon gender discriminatory traditions in order to solve the problems.
this community, the Kipsigis community, follow customs so much. Even customs that are repugnant to justice and morality. Most of them do not know. Most of them follow culture. So you find that they do not have a voice when they go home. They do not have a voice at the police station. They do not have a voice at the chief's offices. They do not have a voice everywhere. And that is why, that is one of the enablers of these violations.
That is a sad reality. Now, Faith, you come from the Ma community, so you resonate when we talk about these toxic traditional beliefs that actually work against both the boy child and the girl child. In this case, female genital mutilation. Widow inheritance is very rampant. Are these things that you're also looking into, considering you also look out for the general family?
Yes, yes, we are looking at these issues, and when I look at gender-based violence, I don't look at gender-based violence from the victim side, predominant victim, which is the woman. I look at gender-based violence from the perpetrator, who has been for years identified as the man. So, and I look at gender-based violence and ask, what is this that we can do to change the situation? One of the things that we are doing as Thriving Families Kenya, in partnership with UNFPA on the ground, is to set up county men's forums. In setting up county men's forums, we intend to have some discussions among men. And these discussions are supposed to change the way men look at some social norms. And we hope that we're going to get more transformative social norms, and these forums are going to actually change how men view the society at large. We're not just looking at women, we are also looking at like something, I think like what I've just said about a man taking another man's wife is something that he will agree with me. When men sit around, they will agree and they will say, we're not going to do this in this community. And I remember in 2019 International Men's Day, we had just the emeritus moderator of PCA then mentioned that in his community they were always appearing in media over the wrong things: FGM, murder, fighting, domestic violence. And he went home and he called the men in his community and he told them, you know what, men, we are not going to do this. We have to sanitize our name internationally. So for that, we are going to change this story of us fighting, beating, and murder and everything. And that stopped. That cleaned the process. So I believe that in setting up the county men's forums, we are going to have change, social norm change that is coming from the men themselves. I have talked to men in Maasai land, and I actually have this on record. And I asked them, so you say that you want your daughters to be circumcised, but then you still go and marry from other communities that are not circumcised. So what exactly are you trying to tell us? And they said, we actually don't want them to be circumcised. These are the men in our community that are saying that. So the other day I was also in Kajiado, and in Kajiado they said, if there is, and this is true statistically, Kajiado has really been able to bring down the rate of FGM in the country because the men have agreed and they have also owned up that their daughters don't need to be circumcised. And then instead of having the women who are circumcisers continue with doing this, they now give them other ways of income generation. So that is the way that society needs to change. Not just educating people and leaving them there, creating awareness and leaving them there. No, we need lasting solutions.
Yeah. Very well said. And speaking of empowerment, I mean, empowering these vulnerable groups clearly gives them a voice, so to speak. Lena, how have you been implementing the same?
Okay, what we have been doing is engaging communities. So what we've been doing is having structured dialogues with communities, identifying some of these barriers and what is the problem. And what has come out mostly is for young girls, vulnerabilities arise around menstrual health management. So if they cannot access sanitary products, then they are getting into relationships or domestic arrangements where they can get this. And that's the beginning of violence for them. For people living with a disability,
community, the fact that they do not have access to information in a way that they can understand, then they remain vulnerable for the fact that they do not have access to information. The same applies to women looking for water, especially in areas where water is a problem. So you are spending your whole day, or you are traversing chunks of sugarcane plantation alone to find water or to find products, then that makes you vulnerable. So one, it has been to engage the whole community, especially looking at it from a very multi-sectoral approach. We are bringing the police departments on board, the administration, the healthcare workers, the children's department, so that it is a collective effort for everybody else. And we are also engaging men in this discussion. I think what Faith has said is quite important. Unfortunately, most of the perpetrators now are family members. Family, or maybe I was in one of the counties, we had this lady who was living with her sister's younger daughter, and her son was violating her sister's daughter. So again, providing that information. And Faith has also said we need to go beyond the victim and also look at the perpetrator, because these are family members. They are bound to come and live together. Whether the justice is followed, they'll do their sentence and they need to go back. So we are also looking at how do we help these perpetrators be reintegrated back into the society, because they're family members, they'll still have to live that. But most important is the dialogue with the community members. And you would be surprised the level of ignorance that, and the questions that people ask from this. Like, the focus has been on sexual violence. Physical violence is not considered as bad as it would be. So if your husband cut your arm or did what, it's not as bad as it would be. There's always the community kangaroo courts that are followed, and often women do not have a voice. One, because of the vulnerabilities associated with access to resources. So if you cannot inherit, then you're forced to stay in your husband's lands, because like you said, you cannot inherit anything from your father. So being that disempowered for women makes you stay in a homestead where you're abused, you do not have access to information, and this makes women more vulnerable. So we are really trying to see, one, how do we bring the whole community on board, because you cannot move without the other. We can't say let's empower girls, let's give them information and move on. No, we also need to bring the man on board, and we've had very structured dialogues with men and issues around that they do not understand. Like some of the violence cases is all about a woman not discussing with the husband but accessing FP. Not that the man hates family planning, but the woman is doing it behind. But if we had a discussion as a couple on which family method and how long, that would be problem. So looking at just issues behind what are the main drivers of GBV, and how do we ensure families are sitting down discussing these issues to minimize. And also we are really involving community health volunteers who as AMREF, you know, we've been on the forefront saying let's acknowledge and remunerate them. So involving them, they are in these households every month, or if not at least on weekly basis, checking on these families. So they have up-to-hand information, and also collecting the information. You know, once you have data, you can then say this is what is happening and this is the changes that we need, because that data allows us now to influence, to talk about issues. So that is what we are currently doing. Yes.
Now, Griffins, when we think about the key populations, how does empowerment look like?
So there are several phases to it. The first phase is to help understand, or to help the general population understand what key populations are, or how what's basically to give a better understanding of key population groups. And here's the reason why that's important, and especially in the context of SGBV. There are so many relations that we never make between general, cultural, and life things and sexual and gender-based violence. A while back, we had an argument with somebody. I think they said like women should not wear short skirts and so on because it drives people to sexual violence. But you see, sexual violence is less about short skirts. It's more about power and you understanding power dynamics. When somebody rapes somebody, it's not because they have been provoked. It's because they know that I'm more powerful than this person. And so even that relationship between power and sexual violence, many people don't make that connection. Many people don't make the connection between their internal prejudices and sexual violence or tolerating sexual violence. You see, I may not be a perpetrator, but I might tolerate it. I might make it difficult for you to report it. I might make it difficult for you to seek services and so on and so forth. And so part of what we need to do for key populations, but also for the general population groups, is to help them understand sexual violence, not from a superficial perspective, but from a more profound perspective. You see, most of us will not perpetrate sexual violence, but many of us will make it easy for the community to tolerate it. And so what we need to do is not to say, oh, don't sexually violate somebody. What we need to say is, when somebody is sexually violated, make it easy for them to report it. Make it easy for them to get services. Make it easy for them to do X, Y, Z, because it improves their overall outcome. So part of what we are doing for key and vulnerable populations is helping people get a better and a more in-depth and a broader understanding of what these communities are and what sexual violence is to these communities, and how to prevent sexual violence and the impact of sexual violence among these communities. And with that, and having a better understanding, it makes it much easier to improve the quality of care and to prevent SGBV from these communities.
Okay, very well said. And even as we bring this conversation to a close, Faith, I mean, at the end of the day, and I think Griffins had mentioned, access to justice is also another deterrent and a huge gap when it comes to GBV. So let's talk about the support structures and programs for survivors, perhaps, that need to be put in place that can also help them or enable them to speak out when they find themselves in such occurrences.
Allow me to step out of the discussion briefly and just bring in something. We are headed to elections. And when you look at the Kenya Human Rights Commission report on electoral-related sexual gender-based violence, one of the key perpetrators were law enforcers. They are my friends, they are my partners. But the reality is that, yes, we have a problem there that needs to be addressed. We also have major issues with young people during that time. I think there's a spirit, or there's just a way of people just becoming careless during elections and violating the rights of others. I think it is right that and I know Polycare has come through, and they're doing a lot of training with the law enforcers, specifically Kenya Police Service. But I want to believe that if we were to look at gender-based violence and justice, our police officers need to change their mindset. If someone walks to them and in confidence they are going to report a case, it is only fair for them to listen, and it is only fair for them to be gracious enough not to talk so rudely and met very funny words to these people. This is someone who's already hurting and someone who's already been violated, and then someone just asks a very absurd question. The other thing is, when men go to report to police stations, wewe ni mwanaume wa aina gani? What kind of a man are you? Those are the questions that men are asked by the people who are supposed to protect them. Ulikuwa unapigwa kama mikono yako iko wapi? You know, I've come to you to tell you, I've been violated, but here you are, you're talking like you're not there, you're not connecting with me. That is already trauma. I'm traumatized, but someone is traumatizing this person even further. I want to believe that if our police officers would change their mindset and start looking at every person who comes to them with a complaint as a client, no matter what kind of complaint they're bringing, I think we will start changing our justice system. The other thing is, why do we have a very lengthy process of reporting of justice? Why should a boy who has been framed for sexual gender-based violence take a whole 2-3 years in remand waiting for justice, only to be told that his semen was not matching with what was analyzed. I think we need justice to be, our wheels of justice need to be faster. We cannot continue saying that we are not violating people's rights, and we have a lot of young men who are in prison right now because someone just decided to frame them and they don't know what to do. And because they are young and there is no voice for the young man, there is no voice for the man, they spend all their lives in prison. Then at the end of the day, if this person now decides, they framed me, I went in, I wasted my time, I don't know what to do with my life, he comes out now as a serious perpetrator. Nobody understands him. No one helps him move or transition from this violation of his rights and this branding and this stigma and this discrimination, and then come back to society. Nobody helps him transition back.
Reintegration.
Yes.
Okay.
So there is so much that we need to do as a country, right from the point of reporting all the way to the point of justice.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Lena, what more needs to be done? Especially during the pandemic, there was a concern that shelters were not as available to victims of SGBV. Is this something that you have seen in the Nyanza region, and what more needs to be done?
Of course, one is ensuring that we are engaging communities, because they are the basic structure of the community at the household level that can provide. And we engage in communities in terms of prevention, ensuring we are giving them information on how to prevent, identify vulnerable groups and protect them. We also need to give them information on reporting, like my colleague has said, there is a long process in reporting. And at some time, if you ask each individual, it's not very clear, where do I run to very fast? Do I go to my village elder? Do I go? So we really need to simplify our referral process and make it something. A young girl, a young boy, a man, whoever, there should be a very simplified process of reporting these cases and follow-up. Two, again, we talk about access to justice. There are so many things that happen in between. What we have also been doing is to train healthcare workers, bring police on board, because this is where there is the evidence collection. It is between the healthcare workers and the police department. So if the two are not working very closely, that's where you get the chain of custody for this evidence cannot be traced, so it's thrown out of court. The DNA was not well connected, so it was thrown out of court. What was collected, they didn't uproot the hair, they cut it, so we didn't get that. So those are the gaps that we are addressing, training healthcare workers. We have also engaged the government chemist in terms of coming to tell these healthcare workers, this is what you need to do. When you are collecting your evidence, do this, do so that it is very clear. And we are also engaging community health volunteers at the very local level. One, to provide the information, to report, and to hold dialogues with the community. I think that's where the rubber meets the road. Addressing some of the cultural factors where they say if your wife dies before you have beaten them, you have to beat the cops. So that is some of the tasks they say. So they will give you a time to beat up the cops. So those are some of the key traditional cultures that we are really engaging communities to not discuss their culture, but to look at the positive aspects of culture that protects men, that women and girls, and also makes everybody feel safe in the community, but also discard all those other traditional practices that disinherit women, promote especially physical violence. And we have been, like I said, we are really stressing that multi-sectoral approach where we are saying, yes, the police are there, but they need to be on the table. We need to bring them the Ministry of Education, because the children spend most of their time in school, to or from school, and the issues around school-related where young girls are accosted as they go or to or from schools, especially in the sugar belt area where there is a lot of sugarcane, and these children are walking alone. So that is where, so that multi-sectoral approach, bringing everybody on board and really agreeing what role do you have as a police officer, like she said. Be kind, just treat everybody as a client. As a healthcare worker, you know, they also ask the same questions. You could be asked the same, or you are left to sit on the table. And what the other thing is the back and forth. So you go to the police station, you are going to go back to the facility. You go to the facility, they say no, you need to be accompanied by a police officer. So go back to the police station
Okay.
and come back. So those are some of the things we are trying to get everybody on the table and to streamline the process.
All right, Griffin, so even as we close.
So I don't want to repeat what they've said, but I think one of the things we need is to improve the continuity of care. When the doctor is taking samples from a sexual violence survivor, they need to know that that sample is going to be used by the police. And so there needs to be a perfect continuation of the continuity of care. One of the reasons why cases fail, for example, in court is because maybe the correct sample was not taken.
Yeah.
That person taking the sample may not have known the importance of that. And so what we need is for all these players, the clinical service providers, the police doing the investigation, and the office of the DPP doing the prosecution need to be speaking together. I need to know what you want from me. I need to know and to understand how important that is for you, so that as we provide and as we ensure that these cases are progressing, they are progressing and they are successful because everyone did their part at every stage in preparing the sexual violence case.
Thank you, Dr. Griffin Manguro. I am very pressed for time. I have to leave it at that. This is a conversation that could go on for a long time, but I have to exit at this point. But powerful pointers put across today. Dr. Griffin Manguro, Country Director and CEO, International Center for Reproductive Health, Kenya. Lena Kanyangi, who is a Project Manager at Amref Health Africa. And of course, Faith Nashipai, who is a Founder Executive Director at Thriving Families Kenya. Thank you all for being part of this conversation. Well, at this point, we take a short break. When we come back, let's address the issue of youth unemployment. We have cried for a long time, but the question is, do we have solutions? Well, I'm here to say there are solutions, and we'll be talking about them in a moment. Stay with us.